It's a new week. You have another silly little story, I understand.
How dare you, but you're right.
Yeah.
I do have a story. I don't
And
think
it
it's
happened.
this actually happened, yeah.
Okay.
Like all my stories actually happened.
Right, for sure.
Okay, so I'm walking to work last week.
Fine.
I am about to cross the street. I look up from my phone. There's a kid in front of me.
Okay.
And he's wearing a backpack. And on the backpack, it says BlockFi.
Really?
And I'm thinking to myself, why does this kid have the backpack of, a once very highly valued...
You know this sounds fake.
I have a picture of this
photo.
right here, because I was like, this is insane.
And until you said BlockFi, it just sounded like a story. That is a child wearing a BlockFi back. Is that your child?
It's not my kid.
Okay.
This kid is way older. I saw something the other day, and I thought to myself, I have to take a picture. I have to show Stacy. I already showed Katie. I just want to know what you think when you see this.
Oh man, it's a BlockFi. It's a backpack that says BlockFi.
And it's worn by like a 13-year-old kid.
Well, that person is definitely not a qualified institutional investor. So
Okay.
And I'm thinking to myself, why does this guy have a BlockFi backpack? Did his parents work at BlockFi and did they get laid off? Was BlockFi just like clearing inventory?
Sounds like you really meditated on this.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of felt like I was living in some sort of metaphor here.
A metaphor.
That like, all that's left of BlockFi is this backpack.
So I like that you said metaphor because in a sense, this is all just a convoluted device to get into the next episode where we're going to talk about where we're actually going from this moment of destruction, who are going to be the screeching phoenixes that rise from the fire. And you recorded another little video.
I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, if I had a BlockFi backpack, I would absolutely wear it. But
to work,
yeah, if you saw me in the building with that backpack on,
I would laugh.
you would laugh,
Yeah.
and that's all I'm trying to do, is make Stacey laugh. But we should talk about where we're going, because it's a good question. You had the BlockFis and some of the other big lenders and other big success stories really come to their knees this summer. And I want to talk about next summer. I want to talk about the summer after that, the next few months and years, where we're going, whether the big players are still going to be the big players or who is trying to rise and rebuild right now, or build.
Because it's time to build.
It is time to build. I've
heard
heard
that.
that.
Yeah, I think we've all heard that. I think one of the more interesting things, or one of the more interesting questions that is going to absolutely drive the direction of that answer is what's going to happen with regulation. And if whether it's the SEC or the CFTC in the US or political pressure from other places or whatever the EU and the UK decide they want to do, how they approach who gets to do what is not just influential, but in some cases deterministic.
Well, that's the thing. You just said a lot of letters.
Yes,
and there's a
many
big
letters.
question over who actually regulates the industry going forward. And it feels like that is one of the big hurdles here. Who actually has any sort of say?
Our genius colleague, Mac Levine, in one of his recent columns, pointed out that the answer to the question of who regulates crypto is almost like unknowable, right? Because on the one hand, you have the SEC being very assertive about establishing its jurisdiction in certain areas, but mostly doing that through enforcement actions rather than policy. You have a very clear and very public, I wouldn't quite describe it as a dispute, but at least a dissent between folks who think the CFTC should have more power in the US. And then you go to places like India, where a lot of that regulation is coming through like tax policy rather than anything else. And so even in the US, whether you're thinking about, state level policy, New York, New Jersey have been very aggressive on what they're allowing, various bills that are trying to work themselves through the House. If one of the ones that's under consideration passes, you would have to effectively be a bank to issue stablecoins. That's going to have huge consequences for the circles and the tethers and the big stablecoin issuers of the world. So, there are a lot of lawyers making a lot of money right now trying to shape the direction of that regulatory conversation.
That's like an evergreen thing, right?
Lawyers make money.
Someone's
Yeah.
making money.
Yeah, no matter what
Always the
happens. What about like this being some sort of inflection point? If we think about,
Positively or negative?
well, I think positively, because if we think about what happened up till 2022, it's kind of the wild, wild west, right? The idea of a lot of experimentation and really light touch regulation. And I'm not saying that by any means we've seen any sort of regulation at this point, but is this a different industry now than it was at the beginning of the year?
No. No.
Well, what? Yeah,
There are
what has
some people
happened?
filed for bankruptcy.
Okay.
So there's that. There are various folks whose tokens are effectively out of commission. I mean, if think back a year ago, there was a Squid Game token that turned out to be a complete scam. So
Shocking.
so I think there have been a lot of ways in which perhaps the less capitalized players or the ones who had insufficient risk management or due diligence have been like washed out a little bit. But the biggest players are still the biggest players, and in some ways they're even bigger than at the beginning of this year.
You mean like FTX coming in and essentially
White knighting
buying
the whole
everything,
industry.
I love
Yeah.
that.
rescuing everyone.
That is the narrative.
But I don't look at them the same way that I look at the players that went under.
Why?
Well, for one, it's an exchange.
With many other businesses that aren't exchanges.
Which haven't gone under. I feel like that's the big difference.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like they had the same exposure to counterparty risk that, the Celsiuses, Voyagers, and
Well-
BlockFi's had.
All of those people that you mentioned were among their various counterparties. I think what you're seeing is who are the people who either managed that exposure better than others or were better capitalized in the event that one of those counterparties blew up. And so, for me, the bigger question is like the tier two, the sort of infrastructure players, people who, like maybe a couple of $1 billion in transactions at a time, mostly a retail customer base, flying slightly under the radar. They're the ones that have really been popping up with like, oh, we're seizing withdrawals. And you're like, wait, I've never heard of you. Like, what's going on here? And I think that part of the market, while we'll continue to have shakeouts there, I don't see the big players changing anything drastically other than perhaps more land grabs.
Okay, so if you're talking about these tier one institutions coming in and being the white knight and sort of a process of consolidation, then I'm thinking to myself, this is totally the antithesis of the promise of crypto, decentralization. But what I'm hearing right now and what I'm seeing right now is that big, well-capitalized firms are coming in, they're buying up the dregs, the shadows of what's left from companies. And in that sense, they're getting bigger. So what we see on the other side of this is a consolidation that actually makes a fewer number of institutions much bigger and much more powerful. That runs counter to the promise of crypto.
Well, if I were a Bitcoin maximalist, which to be clear, I'm not, but if I were a Bitcoin maximalist, one of the things I would point out is none of those companies affect what happens to Bitcoin, right? Like there are going to be people who will say, sure, but at the blockchain layer, at the protocol layer, at the level of indie developers who are still in Ukraine trying to build interesting things, is like bombs fall around them. But it is also true that one of the things that happens when you have a crisis or a shakeup or the prospect of looming regulation is you do have consolidation and you do have concentration.
Is there anyone who's building and hasn't yet been acquired? I mean, to go back to that narrative that we've discussed a few times, that it's time to build, very popular on Twitter. Who is building right now?
Just not in my backyard. Do not build in my backyard.
All right, Mr. NIMBY. I think that where folks are really paying attention is some of the, like, say the DeFi protocol-y type things with names like Uniswap and SushiSwap. I think folks are looking at the potential of, they are large, but they are an interesting part of the ecosystem, like the Yuga Labses of the world, which went from, hey, we have some apes in a collection, to, hey, we're going to acquire various other NFT type collections and companies, to, hey, we're signing deals with Hollywood and the music industry. And I think when you have that sort of, we were a pure play crypto, but now we're extending into mass media, lifestyle, entertainment, you give opportunities for other folks who are like, oh, here's a new place for me to play that didn't necessarily exist before. And one of my favorite types of coverage is when we find actual individuals or like the small mid-size of the market who are able to be like, I am going to make a different kind of art gallery, or I'm somebody working in fashion who is able to do interesting things, or I'm a designer making virtual clothes and avatars for the metas of the world. I'm like, that's cool.
So do we have any sort of vision of the future where we see the technology that's being experimented with right now, and then we start to see that in everyday items, in everyday life?
If you talk to people about crypto long enough, eventually you'll hear the phrase, well, the underlying technology, and at that point you just like take a shot.
I think she just said it's time to build.
It's time
I
to
literally
go.
did not say it's time to build, but fine.
That's what we heard.